So hello, everyone. I'm Joanne Berger-Sweeney, president of Trinity College, and I would love to say welcome to our Downtown Innovation Center. It's really lovely to come out here in the spring and to take a look and to be right truly in the heart of the business district and in the heart of the city. So welcome to all of you, and thank you for making the trek, because I know parking isn't always easy to come down here. So it is my pleasure to welcome all of you to the Shirley G. Wassong Memorial Lecture in European and American Art, Culture, and History. So given that title, isn't it particularly special that we have someone from psychology and neuroscience giving the lecture? But tonight we're honored to have as the Wassong lecturer, Trinity's own Michael Grubb, Associate Professor of Psychology, and who is presenting a lecture entitled, as we can see, Within Opposing Cells, Made You Look, Attention, Perception, and Your Lived Experience. Just as a reminder, support for the Wassong Memorial Lecture in European and American Art, Culture, and History comes from a fund established in 1996 by Joseph F. Wassong, Jr., class of 1959, in memory of his wife Shirley, and augmented with gifts from family and friends. The annual lecture features members of Trinity's faculty and guest scholars in alternating years. The lectures are various academic departments, and their topics range from antiquity to the present day. And as I've said, and I, as a neuroscientist, am particularly happy that this year we're having a lecture by a psychologist neuroscientist. Joseph Wassong majored in history at Trinity, received his MA in history from Columbia University, and spent his career teaching at Naugatuck Valley Community College before retiring in 1999. Shirley Wassong was a graduate of Bryant College and spent her career as a dental assistant. She was a volunteer at St. Thomas Church in Thomaston, Connecticut, and the Thomaston Library and the Thomaston Visiting Nurses Association. She was a member of the Connecticut Historical Society, and at the time of her death in 1995, was the curator of the Thomaston Historical Society. Before I close, I want to give special thanks to the co-directors of Trinity's Institute for Interdisciplinary Studies, or TIS, and that's Kate Berggren and Isaac Kamola. Thank you for coming, and thank you for the work that you've been doing in this obviously very important and exciting area of interdisciplinary studies, and also for your role in organizing this lecture. Without the work of our dedicated faculty and staff, this event would not be possible. So, once again, thank you for joining us, and I will turn it over to Kate Berggren, Associate Professor of English and Co-Director of TIS. I think you will introduce our lecturer.
I will. Thank you. I'm going to do a little balancing act here, see if I can. Okay. Thank you, President Berger-Sweeney. Thank you again to the Wassong family for your generosity in supporting this lecture and celebration. As a token of our thanks, we have a gift for Becky Skinner, who is here tonight. Thank you so much. And I'd love to offer a special welcome to the members of Michael's family and community who are here today. It's really wonderful to see you and meet you. I'm honored today to introduce Professor Michael Grubb. Writing this introduction has immersed me in his work and in the questions animating it, and I know that I'm always going to associate this spring at Trinity with the excitement of talking to him about perception and knowledge and attention, and also about mindfulness and community and the art of hanging out. As one colleague told me, I always know talking to Michael that he's going to have a lot of ideas. And tonight I think we are going to be the beneficiaries of that wealth of ideas. Professor Grubb earned his BA at the University of Oklahoma and his PhD at NYU, where he also did his postdoctoral research. His articles have been published in Cognitive, Affective, and Behavioral Neuroscience, Nature Communications, eNeuro, Journal of Vision, and Attention, Perception, and Psychophysics, among others. I just stopped cutting and pasting at a certain point. He won the Arthur H. Hughes Teaching Award at Trinity in 2020 and was promoted to associate professor with tenure in 2022 and is currently acting chair of the psychology department, which I'm sure has been a joy and a gift forever. In 2022, for his project titled Reward Learning, Selection, History, and Attentional Control, he won an NSF Early Career Development Grant, which will enable him to focus exclusively on research for the upcoming academic year. All right, this is where things get hazy. Can I? All right. Okay, I want now to give some texture to that overview of Professor Grubb's accomplishments. The questions that animate his research are foundational epistemological problems. How do I know anything about the world around me? How do my eyeballs take in information? How is consciousness formed out of the raw material of perception? It's easy to trace these questions back to an undergraduate degree in psychology, but it's just as likely, I think, that they have other sources as well in Michael's biography, an abandoned desire to become a medical doctor, a desire to see the world, several years spent as an expat, observing post 9/11 America from afar, a master's thesis on globalization and the culture of yoga pilgrimage, and then running through it all, a consistent practice of being a teacher in which these epistemological questions are always central. So from these varied experiences emerged an interest in increasingly simple, but really deceptively simple questions. How do I know what I know? How does perception of the world become knowledge of the world? These are the questions that fuel Professor Grubb's research and teaching. His current work on attention contributes to an ongoing debate in neuroscience about these questions. The dominant model of perception goes something like this. The world exists out there. Light rushes into our eyes, creates an image on the retina. That image gets processed and then put back together in the brain. This is a kind of bottom-up model of perception. Everything begins in the world outside of us. A different model, one with deep historical roots, suggests that our brains use pre-existing expectations in combination with our perception of the world in order to create knowledge of the world. In this model, the brain is always using its prior information, checking predictions against the raw signals that we receive from the world. So instead of thinking that the brain receives everything from the world, this model sees the brain as a co-creator, constantly checking its predictions against the raw signals. Professor Grubb's current research centers on experiments that manipulate his subjects' expectations for the sort of abrupt events that tend to capture attention. His lab's preliminary results have convinced him that there's something to this second model of perception that I described, in which the brain is engaging in this constant sort of predictive coding. In his lab, his students are his collaborators in the fullest sense of the word. If you work with Professor Grubb, you walk away with a toolkit for asking the questions that drive high-level research. Along the way, you add invaluable lab skills to that toolkit. You interact with the human subjects. You give them instructions and collect the data. You analyze this data so that you and Professor Grubb can independently verify your results. You work on the article manuscript. For some students, this is the rigorous capstone experience that a liberal arts college is so good at providing. For others, it's this and more, an apprenticeship that meaningfully prepares them for graduate work in psychology or neuroscience. I think that tonight's lecture will be a testament to the vital role that students play as collaborators in Professor Grubb's research. His lecture tonight, as we've heard, is titled Made You Look: Attention, Perception, and Your Lived Experience. Please join me in welcoming Professor Michael Grubb.
So I have a note to thank Kate for a great introduction, but that was amazing. I can't believe you got all of that from the conversation that we had the other day. It was incredibly, just so touching. Thank you. I really mean that. Thank you for that. Okay, so I'm going to take a sip of water. Get started. So when you first saw the title slide, it's quite likely that you first looked at this part of the screen, and my laser pointer is not going to work on this, at this part here. And it's likely that you did so reflexively, without much effort or thought, right? And it just sort of caught your attention. And once that first moment was over, you undoubtedly began to explore the rest of the scene. So that you took in this visual information in such a selective way is at the heart of what I want to talk about today. And now I'm going to show you a more traditional slide in which your attention is far less likely to be guided. But if I had started with this, the whole demo wouldn't have worked. So there are a number of elements in this display that I want to focus on. So let's start at the top. First, I have to say, what an honor it is to be giving a talk in the Shirley Wassong Memorial Lecture Series, because I've been to a number of these talks given by my esteemed senior colleagues, and so it really was an honor to be able to have the opportunity to give this talk at this stage in my career. So a huge thank you to Kate and Isaac for trusting me to give this lecture, and to the Wassong family as well. It really is an honor. I also want to acknowledge the National Science Foundation that funds a lot of the work in my lab, most recently through an early career award that I received last year. And NSF funds not only the science, but also my own personal efforts to make science a more welcoming and inclusive place, specifically for LGBTQ scientists, which are vastly underrepresented in lots of fields. So I'm happy to talk during the reception about our newly inaugurated this year Out in STEM chapter at Trinity, or Visibility, which is a community building initiative that I co-organize at the Vision Sciences Society. And lastly, I want to mention this concept briefly before we get started, because I think it's been top of mind for me for a lot of reasons recently. But one, just this past weekend, I was at the Board of Trustees meeting to be in a session that focused on the power of the teacher-scholar model and how it's most realized in selective liberal arts colleges like Trinity, and what can be done to support faculty in their efforts to really bring this to life. So I want to just sort of touch on this briefly to acknowledge how wonderful it is to be at an institution that prioritizes teaching and research, one that puts them on equal footing in recognizing that they're really mutually reinforcing endeavors. And for me, it's in my lab where teaching and research really come together in a way that's super meaningful for me. So over the past 7 years, I've mentored a number of amazing undergraduate students. And all of the work that I'm going to show you today has been done in collaboration with the people on these slides. And later, during the reception, you'll have the opportunity to meet and interact with students who are currently working in the lab. They're all in this row here. So please ask them about their research. They're also going to, we have a couple of visual demos set up for the reception. They'll sort of show you some fun things. Okay, so let's get started. So if you ask an experimental psychologist to point you to a memorable quote on attention, they will almost certainly point you to something from William James. So James was a medical doctor, a philosopher, and the founder of psychology as a legitimate field of scientific inquiry. And if you asked for a specific quote, they would probably suggest this one. So writing in the Principles of Psychology, the very first textbook in the field, James says, everyone knows what attention is. And here's the full quote. It's the taking possession by the mind in clear and vivid form of one out of what seems several simultaneously possible objects or trains of thoughts. So at the dawn of experimental psychology, James presents us with this view of attention that still resonates with our colloquial understanding of what attention is today. So attention is essentially this process of selective prioritization. But if you asked me, I probably would point you to this quote. This is one of my favorites. So he says, also in the Principles, my experience is what I agree to attend to. Only those items which I notice shape my mind. And as often the case with James, he shows some amazing prescience here. Because here we are 100 years later, so this is an opinion piece, a review article in Trends in Cognitive Sciences, where we see that there's a tremendous amount now of empirical evidence in support of the idea that consciousness requires attention. Or put a little more specifically, the contents of consciousness, that is the sights, the sounds, the feelings, the thoughts, of which we are aware in any moment, require our attention. And I want to show you now an incredibly popular demonstration of what James meant when he said that my experience is what I agree to attend to. So this is a video from what has become a very famous research study done in the late 90s by Daniel Simons and Christopher Shebri.
This is a test of selective attention. Count how many times the players wearing white pass the basketball.
All right, everybody ready? You can count out loud if you want.
How many passes did you count?
Did you get 15?
Correct answer is 15 passes. But did you see the gorilla?
Okay, so that really was there. So some of you have seen this. I could tell already by the laughs that were starting to come before the gorilla even came on the screen. There's something expectation happening there. So you may have seen this, right? And it's very hard to not see it once you know about it. But in this study, they did some very careful probing after people watched the video. And what they found was that about half the participants reported that they had not seen anything except for the players, right? And we now call this phenomenon inattentional blindness, which is in line with the conclusion that people can be unaware of clearly visible objects if they aren't directing their attention to them. Okay, so I want to highlight here the voluntary nature that James proposes. So that we agree to attend to certain items implies that we have a fair amount of control over our attention. But much of the work in my lab is aimed at understanding the limits of attentional control. So in my most serious sepia-toned headshot, I'm going to modify this quote and say that my experience is what I attend to, full stop, and often I have little control over what I notice. So now that you know what attention is, at least in its most general sense, I want to introduce some important distinctions and definitions, because as you'll see, attention can mean a variety of things in different contexts. And then I'll walk you through some insights on attentional control that I'll demonstrate with real data from the lab. Okay? So anytime you look at a complex visual scene like this one, like this image of my husband Kevin and our two dogs on the rocks in Maine, it feels like you're taking in all of this visual information at once. But from the perspective of your visual system, the situation is really more like this. So when your eyes are pointed at Kevin's face, you get a very clear, crisp image of the information at that location in space. And as we move further and further away from where you're looking, the quality of the visual information dramatically decreases. We overcome this limitation by moving our eyes around the scene, right? So we look down to check out Orwell, we look over to look at Huxley, who's a little bit camera shy, back up to Kevin's face, at which time we get curious about the text on his hat, which we now see is the logo for a local bakery that has some of the best sourdough bread in town. These eye movements are what we refer to as shifts of overt attention. So we move our eyes around the world in a way that is observable by other people. And I'm going to contrast this with covert attention a little bit later in the talk. So the reason that we do this is that it has to do with how the visual receptors of the eye are arranged. So you may have heard about rods and cones, and if so, you've probably associate cones with color vision, but cones are also really important for high resolution vision. And so what you see here along the x-axis is basically mapping the angle of the eye like this, and this is the density of the receptors. Cones are in red, and you can see that there's this spot in our eye right here where we have only cones, and we have a lot of them. In fact, most of the cones exist here at this place that we call the fovea. So what we are doing when we move our eyes around the world, which we do all the time, is to basically place information from a particular location so that light from there falls on the high resolution fovea. Okay, so with that background in mind, it is on to our first attentional insight, which is that overt attention feels voluntary, but is guided by forces outside ourselves. And the evidence for this claim comes from a paper that I published in 2019 in the Psychology of Aesthetics, Creativity, and the Arts with Erin Gannon. She was a psychology and film studies double major. And it's called How Filmmakers Guide the Eye, the Effect of Average Shot Length on Intersubject Attentional Synchrony. Okay, so what is average shot length? I'm glad you asked. Average shot length, or ASL, is essentially a quantitative metric related to editing. So it captures the average amount of time that exists between cuts in a movie. That is, when the current visual scene is replaced entirely or shown from a different perspective. So here's an example clip with a short ASL.
Okay, rack 'em up, rack 'em up, rack 'em up, rack 'em up.
Okay. And now for a long ASL clip. This is from The Great Gatsby.
You got everything you need. Perhaps more flowers. I think they did a fine job, don't you? Beautiful. You think it's too much? Oh, I think it's what you want. I think so too.
Okay. And now in this clip, I want you to watch the yellow circle here. So the yellow indicates the eye position of a real viewer as they watched this scene from Gravity in the lab. And notice how the yellow circle follows important events in the scene, but also notice all of the exploratory eye movements when the person looks around to check what else is there.
1 hour.
Outstanding. Installing your system in the hovel is the purpose of this mission, and so we appreciate your patience, Doctor. Kowalski, we know you don't care about things like this, but for your information, this delay is not going to be long enough for you to break Anatoly Solovyev's spacewalking record. It seems like you're going to be left...
75 minutes shy? Never crossed my mind.
Matt, it's been a privilege.
Right back at you, Houston.
Enjoy your last walk.
May I go to assist Dr. Stone in removing the panel?
Assistance.
Okay. So as we just saw with Gravity, directors are very skilled at arranging a scene in a way that gives you something obvious to look at. And indeed, when you ask a group of people to watch the same film, their eye movements are highly synchronized, at least initially. But viewers also love to explore visual scenes, so while we might look at the most obvious object in the beginning, eye movements soon diverge as we begin to seek out elements of the scene that interest us. So rapid editing means that the scene is changing more frequently, which gives us less time to explore, which takes us to the hypothesis of this study, which is that if rapid editing is more effective at guiding the eyes and synchronizing attention across viewers, then we should be able to experimentally manipulate the average shot length, and the impact of that will be to change the degree of synchrony across viewers. And I'm going to walk you through the methods and analysis for this first study in some detail just to give you a sense for how we do this in the lab. So this is a really pretty simple setup. We had 8 film clips that were about 3 minutes each, and these clips were carefully selected to contain a range of average shot length values, right? So we had people watch clips like Batman, The Dark Knight, which was really rapid, and some like Great Gatsby, which we had these long extended scenes, and then some in between. And we just measured eye movements while participants watched the clip. In my lab, I have a really great commercial eye tracker, which collects X and Y position 500 times a second with really good spatial resolution. So we generate a lot of data over these 24 minutes, 8 times 3. OK, so what you get from this are data that looks like these. So the black line is eye data from an individual viewer. And on the y-axis up here, this is the eye position in pixels. And on the x-axis, this is time. So these are data from the x dimension, that is the horizontal position of the eye moving left and right across the screen. Now in red is the average eye trace of all of the remaining viewers in the study. And the thing I hope you notice is that they tend to rise and fall at very similar places. You can already see this synchrony. But we actually want to put a quantitative estimate on that, so we're going to compute the synchrony in the x dimension for this first participant relative to everyone else. And to do that, we just take we compute what's called the correlation coefficient of these 2 time series, which is going to give us a number that ranges from 1 to -1. 1 would mean that the eye movements are completely synchronized. It's basically exactly the same trace. And 0 is that there is no relationship at all between the 2 lines. We would not expect to get anything like anti-synchronicity in this study, but I thought it was important just to tell you that they do range from 1 to -1. Step 2, we repeat this in the y dimension, so as the eye moves vertically, and then we average those 2 values together to get a single measure of attentional synchrony for this participant for this clip. And then we repeat this for all of the 8 movie clips. And then what we do is we want to understand, is there a relationship between the amount of synchrony that we observed and the shot length of the clip that they viewed? So I'm going to plot those like this. We're going to put attentional synchrony on the y-axis and average shot length on the x. And what you can already hopefully see is that the range of the y-axis is from 0.4 to 0.8. So we're going to have some really strong, robust correlations already. And the question is, do those attentional synchrony metrics, are they related to the average shot length? So we just do a simple regression here where those are individual clips for one person, we fit a line to that, and we pull off the slope, because the slope is indicative of how changes in shot length relate to changes in synchrony. So we get, from all of that data, we boil it down to one number for each person, which is the slope of that line. And we repeat this for all the participants in the study, and you can see that these values, that this negative relationship between average shot length and attentional synchrony is consistent across all of the observers. All of the slopes of the best fitting lines are below 0, indicating that more rapid editing is associated with greater attentional synchrony. Now you can apply a number of different statistical tests to these data. Here I'm showing you just the t-statistic and the p-value. And for those of you with less experience with statistics, I'll just say that these results are extremely robust from that perspective. OK, but we aren't done yet, because whenever possible, I always aim to fulfill this principle for studies in my lab. So we want to replicate the finding in a new group of participants. So that's one of the hallmarks of really good science. And then we want to use that replication as an attempt to extend our understanding or rule out some lingering concern. So after analyzing the data that we just looked at, Erin and I were talking. This is her thesis work. And it was like, we decided that we should do this again. We're going to run a second experiment. And the goals of the second experiment are, again, to replicate this attention average shot length relationship, and also ensure that our results were not somehow specific to the clips that we chose. Because we had a lot of different genres from different time periods, and maybe there was just something weird about what we put together. So what we did was we used the same 8 films, but we found segments of those films that sort of had the opposite kind of ASL from experiment 1. So for example, we would find a different portion of The Great Gatsby that contained really rapid editing. And so we could sort of swap the places. And so this would allow us to rule out the possibility that it was just something about the genre or the films that we had chosen. And indeed, that was the case. So this is the results for experiment 2. Again, all of those slope values are below 0, which is really strong, robust evidence that there is this relationship between average shot length and attentional synchrony. This is the last figure from this paper, and it's just showing a between experiment comparison, really providing converging evidence from the regression results that if you just look at the 3 films that had the longest ASL, or the sort of the most rapid editing in experiment 2, and then compare those films to much slower editing in experiment 1, there is a difference in the synchrony values, just like we expected, and the same for the other ones. Okay, so overt attention feels voluntary, but when we're watching a film, there's all of this guiding that's going on that we really don't have much conscious access to. And it's not just attention that synchronizes. So if you ask people to watch these commercially produced, well-edited movies in an fMRI scanner, you will find that the time course of brain activity is also correlated between individuals across large swaths of the cerebral cortex. That's what you see in A and B. So these are some images from a review article in Trends in Cognitive Sciences from one of my PhD advisors, David Heeger. And one aspect of this work that I've always found super interesting, and this whole body of research was done by Uri Hassan, who's at Princeton. So the most interesting thing for me is what you see in panel D. So if you just show people an unedited segment of reality, you just set up a camera in Washington Square Park, you don't get this neural synchrony. And why is that? Because there's no attentional synchrony, right? There's no director or editor behind the scenes that's guiding the eyes of the viewers. Okay, so we're back to the beach. We're looking here at Kevin's face, and all of a sudden, there is this flash over on the rocks. And what happens in that situation is the brain, the visual system, will reflexively allocate some visual attention over to that region of space, and it'll happen very quickly, reflexively, and automatically, right? And we get a little bit more information of like, oh, okay, it's just some people over there, maybe they set off some fireworks or something like that. This kind of attention is called covert attention because it happens in the absence of an observable eye movement. So our eyes are still fixated at one place, but our attention is drawn reflexively to a different spatial location, which is why we call this covert spatial attention. And we often move our spatial attention around the world. So right now, you might be looking up there, but maybe paying attention to something else that's going on, or when you're playing sports or driving. And often we do that in a voluntary manner. But this kind of attention is called exogenous spatial attention because it is elicited by things in the external environment. So our attention is basically reflexively drawn to certain locations in a way that is effortless and involuntary. So this attentional highlight, is that all the time our attention is captured by physically salient objects. And the way that we do these kinds of studies in the lab is pretty simple. So we start with the fixation point like this. We have people make sure that their eyes are fixed in a certain spot. We have an eye tracker. We make sure that they don't move them. And all we do is we just present these really tiny, super irrelevant little flashes somewhere on the screen. And you can kind of see it happening over here. Then we present some visual information, and then we ask people to make a judgment about one of them, which is the target. So does anybody remember what was the orientation of that line? Was it clockwise or counterclockwise or vertical? Very good. So in this experiment, you get some feedback. If you, said counterclockwise, you get some different feedback. But what happens is you would do this kind of really simple visual task hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times. And we generate a lot of data under two different conditions. So one condition would be when your attention was drawn to the target location by that flash, and one would be when your attention was drawn to the other location also by the flash. But it's the same target at the same location, same judgments are being made, but your attention has been pulled in different places. And what we can do is we can compare different metrics for the task, like accuracy for that judgment or the time to take that judgment. And the canonical finding here, at least behaviorally, is that performance will go up. You'll be better at the task for attended locations, and you'll be faster. Or you'll be worse at unattended locations and slower. And there's a tremendous amount of neurophysiological and fMRI evidence showing that not only do we see these behavioral changes, but we get co-occurring changes in the neural response to attended stimuli. Okay, so you don't have to just take my word for it either in this little demo. I'm going to show you some real data from this paper investigating the role of exogenous cueing on selection history formation, which I published in Psychonomic Bulletin and Review in 2019 with two neuroscience majors who were also first-year interdisciplinary science program students that joined my lab in their very first year. And you can see a very similar trial sequence here. So this study is really in the vein of the we're going to replicate and extend. So we do this sort of classic replication of showing this exogenous cueing effect in the service of asking a kind of different question, which I'm not going to dwell too much on, but I'm happy to talk about it later. But so you can just see here, we present these cues. They're totally task irrelevant. And what you can see here, these are 22 observers that did, again, hundreds and hundreds of trials. And I'm showing you the change in accuracy, so valid minus invalid. All of those numbers should be greater than 0, and most of them are. And indeed, the mean across participants is robustly above 0, just like we expect. We see the same kind of thing with the response time data. Most of these numbers are below 0 because valid should be faster, so these numbers will be smaller for response time. And again, we get this sort of classic effects. So that's just some preliminary evidence or showing you that something sudden just appears and there are real behavioral consequences. And as I said, there's also a tremendous neural consequence as well. And what's interesting about these studies is this is one of the most robust findings. It's so easy to get this in the lab. You just put people down, and you can even tell people, so you're going to notice some flashes. Those flashes are irrelevant. They will not provide you any information. You should ignore them. And you can't, right? This is an automatic process that the brain is constantly doing for good reasons. If something is suddenly appearing in the environment, your visual system is like, hey, we should probably know about that, and let's get some more information. And in environments like these, right? So this is a scene from Shibuya in Tokyo, Hachiko Mae, where there's, these kinds of environments are exogenous attention is being pulled all the time in all of these different directions. And this one is probably familiar to lots of us. Sudden lights flashing up on a little device that we all carry around all the time, right? There's a reason that those flashes, that they don't just like gradually appear on your phone, which you think we might be a little less intrusive. No, they flash on because they will capture your attention. Same reason why the notifications on your computer will slide in from the side, right? So that has a really strong effect on the visual system. Covert attention goes first, and then we typically make an eye movement, a shift of overt attention. Okay, so the fact that we have all of these onsets in everyday life, especially with like smartphones and things, it got me and some of the lab members a few years ago thinking about whether or not these kinds of onsets that appear, if they have some sort of meaning to us, right? So when your phone lights up, does that do something different or more than if something just random happens, right, in the environment? So in 2020, this paper was published. This was years of work, but it culminated in this 2020 paper with Devin Butler, who was a psychology major, and he's now in the PhD program at University of Maryland. So this is called Sudden Onsets Reflexively Drive Spatial Attention, but those that predict reward do more. Again, replication and extension here. So same kind of trial sequence. In this experiment, we used associative learning. So this is like, if you remember Psych 101, if you've had that, classical conditioning, where we have some feature in the world that is always associated with some particular outcome. So in this study, we manipulated the luminance of the cue, and that could lead to a trial-to-trial reward or to no reward. And for half the participants, these white circles would lead to a reward, and then we counterbalance this for the other half of the participants. And you might feel like, well, 3 cents isn't that much, but when you're doing 1,000 trials, that can add up pretty quickly, right? So people leave the lab with a nice cash bonus at the end of this study. But again, these are totally irrelevant. They don't provide any information about the actual task, but we were interested in whether those onsets that carried some predictive information actually would do more or impact the attentional effects. And we replicated the main findings of faster accuracy in the valid compared to invalid, and better accuracy and faster response time. This figure is a little bit complicated, but I'll just show you that changes in accuracy should be greater than 0. These are individual participants, and most of those dots fall to the right of 0. The changes in RT should be less than 0, and again, most of these dots fall below 0. And this is really the prime replication quadrant, and this is our mean across participants with bootstrapped error bars, and indeed, this is exactly where it should be. But this figure also demonstrates something else, that for some participants, they'll have like no change in accuracy, but really big RT effects, or no change in RT, but really big accuracy effects. So for the main thing that we found in this study, we combined across the two metrics, and this is a sort of caricatured view of the results, which is basically that both kinds of cues do the spatial attention thing. They make you better and faster. But what we found is that when those onsets actually predict upcoming reward, there's this global boost across all the conditions, across the whole visual scene of people getting better, right? So some sort of arousal signal or something that says, hey, reward is coming, and you get this increase in both conditions. Okay. And for the last little insight here, I'm going to talk about the attentional blink. So attention blinks and you miss things when that happens. This was an experiment that we did in 2020. So I had 4 thesis students that year, and this was like the first full year of COVID where we couldn't do any in-person data collection. So I was like, how are we going to do this? I don't know. And we ran a paradigm online using a sort of web-based server and programmed some experiments in the lab to run in a web browser. And this actually ended up working really well. Again, we are sort of replicating and extending into new area. This paper ended up being about decisional changes, which I can talk about later, but I just want to show you the main attentional blink phenomenon. So we can see if this will work. It doesn't work super well on screens, but maybe it'll be good. OK, this is going to be fine. So did anybody see what the white letter was? Good. Was there an X present? Maybe. We're not sure. Look for one now. What about now? So we have 2 questions, and let's do one more. White letter was? And was there an X present? OK, good. So this is basically the task where we have 7 to 15 random letters. They're always presented one at a time in order, 1 letter every 100 milliseconds. And there's always going to be 1 letter rendered in white, which we call the target letter. And then after that, we present these 8 random letters after the first target. And half the time, one of them is going to be an X. And when the X does appear, it can be at one of 8 temporal positions. OK, so the main finding, and this is like a canonical finding. People have been studying this for a very long time. There's probably thousands of papers on the attentional blink paradigm. You get data that look like these. So whenever the X, so let's just start at the end. When the X appears at the end of the stream, people detect it really well. It's not at all difficult. Whenever the X comes right after that first letter, people only see them about half the time. And actually, the strongest place is about 200 to 300 milliseconds after the first detection of the white letter. Finding the X drops way down, right? So people are missing the X about 70% of the time. And the idea here is that attention is like an eye blink, right? So you allocate attention to the white letter, you do all the cognitive things that are required for you to identify and remember what the letter is going to be, and there's this period where everything has to reset so that you're ready to kind of emerge back into the visual world, and when you insert another important target in that time frame, people miss it, right, substantially. And we can contrast this with a control experiment, which you'll see is probably a little easier. So now all you have to do is look for an X. Was it present, yes or no? Yes, very good. And when you do that task, it's really good. Totally flat across the board. The white letter doesn't interfere at all. But it's this huge jump between when you get to just ignore the white letter, you have no problem with this task. And we can combine across all the lag positions. And again, for those of you who know anything about t-tests or statistics, these are like ridiculously strong effects. I wish all of the data in the lab, were this compelling. But it's a super robust phenomenon, and it's also extremely consistent across individuals. So these dots are all individual people, where we basically plot their percentage of X detected in the attentional blink versus their performance in the control. If those two numbers were the same, all the dots would fall along the line. The fact that all the dots, except for that one, are above the line means that this number is smaller than this one. So everyone in the study, except for that one person, was showing this attentional blink. OK, so attention blinks, and you miss things when that happens. And you might be sitting there thinking, OK, well, fine, these are some nice data, but when am I ever going to be searching for an X within a letter stream, having identified some other letter? It all seems pretty contrived. But I hope I can convince you that all of these paradigms are pretty good proxies for real-world situations. And in this one, I think they all come together. So we make overt shifts of attention all the time when we're driving, right? And some of them are important for the driving that we're doing, like monitoring the lanes of the road before us, or reading the upcoming street signs, looking in the side mirror to see if we can safely change lanes. Some of them are important for other goals that we do while we're driving, right? We use the rear view mirror to make sure that the kids in the back seat are doing okay, we're engaging with the passenger in the seat next to us, and so on. And we often do a lot of these things covertly as well. We look straight ahead at the road while we're monitoring the GPS, or we're reflexively drawn, to the radio or some other salient feature in the car. Okay. But sometimes we find ourselves in this very dangerous situation. The thing that captures our attention is a flash and a buzz from the phone on the seat next to us. And from Butler and Grubb, we know that that flash will draw attention. That was the replication part. But the extension taught us that in that study, right, when the buzz signals that a reward is imminent, that some information is waiting for us. If only we pick up our phone just to check real quick, then we get this temporary global boost in arousal, which for many of us is enough to reach over and grab the phone. So public service announcement, when we allocate our attention to the phone, just for a moment, attention blinks, and a lot can happen in 400 milliseconds. So if you remember nothing else from this talk, please keep your phones away while you are driving. OK, so I want to zoom out a bit now and start to wrap things up. And to do so, I'd like to introduce a concept developed by a German biologist in the early 20th century. So an Umwelt is the unique sensory world to which a given organism has access based on the sensory receptors that it possesses, and the range of stimuli to which those receptors are sensitive. This concept featured heavily in a recent book that some of you may have heard about by Ed Yong, a wonderful science writer at The Atlantic who just won a Pulitzer for his coverage during the early days of COVID. But this book is really great. It's all about sort of different animals and how they experience the same physical world given their own sensory systems and what they have access to. And here's an example of our human Umwelt. So what we call light is only a tiny sliver of the electromagnetic spectrum. We have photosensitive receptors in our eyes that can absorb energy, but only in this narrow band. So we're insensitive to ultraviolet and infrared light. So even though it may be there in the environment, we can't detect it, at least not with vision. And so this has some perceptual consequences that you might find sort of really interesting or disconcerting, depending on how the degree to which you feel that your perceptions map on to the physical world that is out there. So when we look at this flower, we experience the petals as uniform, but they aren't uniform. They actually have this interior portion shown here on the bottom that reflects ultraviolet energy, which is really helpful if you're a honeybee and you have receptors that can actually detect light in the ultraviolet range. So this is just a really simple example of how in some cases the way that things seem to us, how they appear in our experience, is not exactly how they are. But as we learned at the beginning of the talk, even when things are detectable, that is, we possess the necessary receptors for accessing them in our human umwelt, we often fail to see them when our attention is directed to something else, giving rise to an attentional umwelt that varies from person to person, shaping and defining our moment-to-moment consciousness and experience of the world. And there are many moments in our everyday lives when we choose to allocate our voluntary attention in a way that restricts our moment-to-moment access of the world around us and to the people that we share it with. So I want to end with one final quote on attention. This one is from Simone Weil, a French philosopher and mystic, who said, "Attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity." So in these moments of extreme digital connectedness, many of us are feeling, paradoxically, more and more disconnected from our fellow human beings. So now more than ever, giving your undivided attention to someone can be a genuine and powerful act of kindness. So thank you for your attention today, for coming here, and I'm happy to take questions.
Great. I'm Isaac Kamola, and I'm here to moderate. What a great talk, Michael.
Thank you,
so
Isaac.
wonderful. That was really, really fantastic. Thank you. I now have the power of a microphone. So why don't we take 2 or 3 questions from the floor, and then maybe you can answer them, in whatever order you want. Does that work?
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Who's got a question? Yes, Joanne.
A question for which I do not want the answer. What happens to attention as you age?
That's a good one.
Yeah, in the back there.
I know you said in your experiment with the editing that you did certain shots so it didn't depend on genre.
Yeah.
Did you find that genre didn't come into effect, or for example, is edited very differently usually than a romance? Did that come into effect with people watching clips when it came to genre? Did genre really depend even with those other variables? Were there certain variables you couldn't avoid because of the genre or the type of film that it was?
Okay, that's a good question.
One more question.
Let's do over these.
Oh, yeah. Sarah, did you want? Yeah.
Meg, did you have it?
I wanted to know if there were any of these experiments run where you were looking at gender, neurotypical brains, or age as a factor.
Okay. So let me start with the question at the back, because I think I can answer that quickly and probably most directly. The easiest answer is that there is definitely more to guiding attention than average shot length. And I don't know if you know, many of you might not know this, but that gravity actually only has one shot. So it is one long continuous shot, the whole movie. So we put that in the experiment because we wanted to kind of get at this question of, if we find a tremendous, what is the baseline level of synchrony that we can find for a clip that actually doesn't have any cuts? It's still, as you saw with the video, it's still really well edited and there are obvious things to look at, but cuts cannot be the full story. And I think there's something about editing has changed over time as well as with genre. And so movies, we actually tried, so I know I showed you a clip of The Dark Knight. We actually couldn't find a slow segment in that enough to put it in experiment 2 in a new place. And so I think there's something about how editing itself has changed over time, and so you might get historical effects that are sort of co-occurring. So of course, average shot length is not the whole story, but as like I think as a baseline starting point, it clearly affects how people attend. And whether you can always find exceptions to that though, like we found with gravity. So that's a great question. I mean, I guess you could probably do you could do a whole study where you find a consistent genre and then do the manipulation just within that genre. That would be interesting to kind of look at. So these other questions about so first of all, there's a huge literatures on atypicalities in attention and attention in aging. And that literature can be sometimes inconsistent. So you'll read, so in these studies, they were all Trinity undergraduates, except for, even that one. So we do have some studies in the lab where we do, that we've run online, which actually have large international populations that are not undergraduates, but everything I showed you today are. And there are, so work I actually did as part of my PhD thesis was looking at the role of these kinds of attentional mechanisms in individuals with autism spectrum disorder, which we did not find that there were differences in these kinds of attention. So again, it sort of goes back to this idea of we think about attention as this monolith, but when you start to read the literature, you start to see how important it is to actually really kind of specify the exact attentional mechanism that you're looking at. And there are a lot of studies, though, that look at something called joint attention, which do show a tremendous amount of differences. So in the studies that I showed you here, we weren't looking specifically at differences in attention across individuals or different kinds of clinical disorders or anything like that. But there is a tremendous amount of work that does that for sure. And then attention in aging, I think, yeah, there are some deficits that come about, but what's really hard is that, when you study any kind of big cognitive construct like attention, it can be really difficult to disentangle, is it an attention difference? Is it a working memory difference? Even those two constructs, how closely are they related? Yeah, is it a visual deficit? Exactly, right? So, there's a lot of work there, but I think nothing that, my work has not touched on that in this realm.
My experience is probably a back issue too. Any other questions?
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Yeah.
I have 100 questions, but I can ask you back at Trinity. The question I want to ask you is, I was struck by the consistency of your data, and perhaps it's because it is truly undergrads, but I'm wondering is there a literature that suggests that experience-based plasticity might cause differences in these effects, or are these so low down, sort of bottom-up effects like covert attention and overt attention that you just don't see any differences between people based on experience?
Well, so,
think about driving.
Yeah, no. So I didn't present these data, one, because they're not published yet and they're not peer reviewed. But we are working on some stuff in the lab right now. Actually presented some of my students in perception. I showed them some hot off the press data last week. Where even we do the classic, there's an abrupt onset over here, report the orientation of the line, but we had that little fixation cross, and what we did was we gave people one of two colors that the fixation circle was, and so that would eventually give some information about whether or not there would be an abrupt onset somewhere in the visual scene. and we sort of let them, we never explicitly tell them that that's what these pairings are, but we are seeing these changes in the way that the visual system deals with those abrupt onsets based on one session of learning. Back to what you were talking about in the introduction, this idea of perception that what the brain is doing is constantly trying to predict the incoming sensory signal. And so you can modulate even these really basic low-level effects by giving information. And so I think it's like you're never going to erase the covert exogenous effect, but you can modulate it, if that makes any sense. And so in the aggregate, yes, all of those things add up to unique, things that are unique to a given human and its experience in the world. Yeah. Susan, I saw your hand earlier. Did you have a...
Yes, I did. I wanted to mention, just on a positive note, the things that you mentioned today all really play into magic, being able to enjoy a magic show. And I didn't know if there's been analyses of different magicians, if magic has intuitively taken advantage of these exact attentional blink timings and shot length sort of concepts that you've presented today.
100%. I think I think it might really go both ways. So I think that there are magicians, but also film editors and directors who are natural psychologists, intuitive psychologists. They just get how humans work and how to present information or obscure information in a way that I think is really, they're skilled at that in a way that they might not be able to explain how they do what they do. But I think that is like something that it's a skill that people develop, especially those that are really good. And that there's a lot that can be learned. Scientists can learn a lot from people who have had tremendous experience in guiding the attention of those around them. One of my PhD advisors, Dr. Marisa Carrasco, gave a big joint lecture at the National History Museum in New York with a magician. It was sort of all on this topic, and she's one of the leaders in the world of attention. So there's a lot of synergies there for sure. Yeah.
How can someone build stronger attention, better attention?
You indeed can train it, and I think it depends on which aspect of attention you want to train. And so mindfulness, meditation, all of these are forms of training the kind of attention I think that we think about a lot, that William James talked about a lot, but one of the most, so the biggest instructions in mindfulness training is to sort of, bring your attention to your breath or some other object of focus. Notice when you get distracted. Bring your mind and your attention back to the focus, and you just practice that. And you can get better at that. I think no one ever gets perfect at that. But there's a lot of really interesting psychology and neuroscience research now showing the effects of that on the nervous system and on the brain, and they seem to be altering neural circuits, and really the experience of doing that and training attention in that way can actually change the structure of the brain. Yeah.
When it comes to the average shot length study that you did,
Yeah.
I think that there would be a point in time where the shots are so quick
Yeah.
that it actually has the opposite effect on the attention.
Yes, I think that if it was too, you would probably, I think what you would get is people would just look away from the screen, or they would just sort of park in the middle, and so you wouldn't get a lot of variance, and that there has to be some, I think it can be very tiring as well to let your eyes be guided that much. And people like to explore, so you'd probably also get a little bit of disengagement just because it was too fast and they weren't getting to actually look at the things they wanted to look at. So there's definitely that sweet spot between just enough guiding but not overdoing it.
So this could be completely off
Yes, you could do, I mean, you could fit a much more complex model to that, for sure. We can talk, we actually did in the paper. I'll talk, if you want to talk about it later, I'll tell you what we did, yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Mm-hmm.
Is there kind of cultural, like if you're, I mean, your tests are on individuals, so maybe this isn't a fair question, but can you identify kind of cultural trends that lead to your aggregate participant, your average participant having more or less attention, right? Like, you know, is there, you know, a society that where people are born in with cell phones, is that going to be different than people who were born in the era of the book? Or is that untestable?
No, I mean, it's a great question. I think, I'm trying to just think of like, what research, apart from just speculating, I think there's some studies that try to look at how we attend to sort of the local versus the global, or in any visual scene, if you're sort of, you can attend to local elements or the scene as a whole, and that that certain tasks will be better suited for people who take more of a sort of holistic global view of the scene. They'll do better in this kind of task, and people that do a more sort of local zoomed in will do better in this kind of task. And I think there's some research showing some differences across cultures that may or may not have something to do with sort of like individualist versus collectivist cultures, how just vision or what people sort of pay attention to in a scene, is it highly specialized or more global? There's some data there. I think those, as with most things, you know, not all studies show that. There's some controversies, but I think that's been a lot of the general findings.
Is there any other questions? Do you want to give us a little bit of a preview of what we'll see in the other?
Oh yeah, so we just have, it's pretty simple. We just have there are going to be two different visual demos set up. So one of them is a phenomenon called binocular rivalry, where there's one constant image that's coming in, but we have some red and green filter glasses, which is there's going to be some perceptual alternation, some rivalry that happens. Even though the incoming image never changes, your experience of that image will sort of vacillate back and forth between these two things. And the students can talk about some reasons why. And then we have another demo set up that's around a phenomenon called complementary after images that has some interest. There's an interesting visual takeaway, what fascinates me all the time is that you'll look at this demo and we can all agree on the shape and the color of the thing that is not there. And if that doesn't make any sense to you, well, go to the demo and be wowed, because it's indeed, yeah, no, it's not there, but it is indeed that green circle, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Great. Thank you, and join me in giving Michael the sort of thanks for your time and your expertise and your generosity.
Thank you.
And then the inevitable question of do you do the experience before or after the drink? But I'll leave that up to you. So, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Isaac.